I'm in the village of Woolton in Liverpool, in the graveyard of St Peter's Church. Events here on the 6th of July 1957 changed the world. It's hard to overstate the importance of this place, that date, and the events that unfolded here. I'm talking about the Beatles, of course. This is hallowed turf to fans around the world. But there are people who aren't fans. They like their own music and don't care about the Beatles. I never pass up an opportunity, just like I'm not passing up this opportunity, to remind them that, like them or loathe them, without them, your music wouldn't exist today in its current form. Without the Beatles, you don't get the Jam. Without the Jam, you don't get Oasis. Without the Beatles, you don't get the music that you have today. I want to share two things with you today in this video. The first thing is something curious. The second thing is something absolutely monumentally world-changing. Don't go away. You don't want to miss this. Here's the curious thing. I'm in the churchyard of St Peter's in Woolton. In 1965, when Paul McCartney had the music and most of the lyrics to the song that would become Eleanor Rigby, he still hadn't come up with a name for the main character. He just knew it had to be 3 syllables and 2 syllables to fit in with the song. Da-da-da-da-da. He liked the name Eleanor, though. That stemmed from working with Eleanor Bron in the film A Hard Day's Night in 1964. So that was his 3-syllabled first name, Eleanor. So it was going to be Eleanor da-da. Then he happened to be in Bristol and noticed a shop with Rigby on a sign. Ah, he thought, that's the surname. The rest is history. It was a worldwide mega hit. But some years later it was pointed out to Paul that here in the graveyard at St Peter's there is a grave for Eleanor Rigby, and here it is. John and Paul met for the first time just across the road. They often walked through this churchyard as teenagers. Had he spotted the grave at some point? Did it linger in his mind? Did the two names Eleanor and Rigby somehow feel right to Paul because he had a distant memory lodged in his brain from this gravestone? We'll never know, and neither will Paul. He's talked about this in several interviews and he can't be sure. I think he did see this grave, and I do think he did like the name. But he'd have seen that grave when he was 15 or 16. He was 25 when he wrote Eleanor Rigby, and though he liked the names, he will have forgotten where he first saw them 9 years later when he wrote the song. I think Eleanor Bron and the shop in Bristol just rekindled his memory, and that's why he immediately liked those names for the song. But actually they'd been festering away in his mind for 9 years, and by that time he'd forgotten where he'd heard them. Paul just isn't sure, which I think allows me to speculate. Now for my main reason for coming here. The village hall where Lennon and McCartney first met sadly isn't open today, but they're opening it up just for us. We are going to the exact spot where world history was made. We are going to see exactly where Lennon first met McCartney. It was at the Church Garden Fete on the 6th of July 1957. The big expectations of the day was the crowning of the Rose Queen and a display from the local police dogs. John's group, the Quarrymen, had been invited to play in the hope more younger people would attend.
And my mother managed, because my mother was very clever at managing things like this, to organise it so that we were the entertainment. Now, first of all, we played in the back of the lorry in the field, which is the Scouts field at the back of the church, and then in the evening we went over to play for a dance that they were putting on. We were playing at that time mostly Lonnie Donegan stuff.
The Quarrymen were on stage later for a third gig in the evening, following the George Edwards Band. It was whilst the band were preparing for the evening gig that McCartney was introduced to Lennon by a mutual friend and sometime quarryman, Ivan Vaughan. It had been a beautiful summer's day in the churchyard before history was made later in the afternoon. The event was the highlight of the local church calendar and an ideal opportunity to advertise the filmy magic of Bear brand gossamer nylons. But the real filmy magic happened just over the road at the church hall. This meeting would change the lives of Lennon and McCartney and change the world. Today I had the place to myself and I just couldn't believe my luck. I literally can't believe where I am. I'm in Woolton Village Hall, St Peter's Village Hall, the place where Paul McCartney met John Lennon for the first time on the 6th of July 1957. This is rock and roll history. The stage that John played on has been removed and it's now in a museum, so you do need to use your imagination a little here. I can digitally put part of the actual stage back in place though to help you out. People who were there that day, including Pete Shotton, put the Lennon and McCartney meeting here, just in front of the stage and a few feet back from the left-hand wall. The Quarrymen were having a beer, discussing their earlier performance and getting ready for the evening show. McCartney was brought over and introduced to John by their mutual friend Ivan Vaughan.
Did you know each other when you were 13?
Yes, that's when we met.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell us about the meeting.
At Woolton Village Fete. I was playing at a garden fete and below, or the village where I lived, or
Playing
just
at
outside
what?
Liverpool.
Just
Playing with a group,
In a group.
the skip group. And he came along and we met. And
I knew one of his mates, Ivan, was a mutual
very
mate.
complicated.
Hey, mutual mate of ours, and he introduced us and things.
This is a truly historic place. So you need to imagine on the 6th of July 1957, which would have been a lovely summer's day, John Lennon and the Quarrymen had played 2 sets behind the church over the road at St. Peter's, and they'd gone down very well. And at this point, they're having a beer and having a rest before the evening show. From eyewitness accounts, this is the spot where they met. I am told that this line here does depict where the stage was battened to the wall. So the stage came to here and was about this high, and that's where John Lennon and the Quarrymen played on the 6th of July 1957, later that evening. But it was earlier in the afternoon that John Lennon first met Paul McCartney on the spot where I'm talking to you now, on this very spot. Paul McCartney stood there with his guitar. John Lennon sat here having a beer in the afternoon, getting ready to go on with the Quarrymen later in the evening. If we just forget Elvis for a second, which we can't, but if we do, this is where modern music started. I am stood, would you believe, on hallowed ground. That seismic moment. Lovely summer day, early afternoon. John's just played 2 sets in the church grounds with the Quarrymen. He sat over here having a drink with the Quarrymen, getting ready for the evening performance. Ivan Vaughan brings Paul McCartney in to meet John Lennon. I assume the reason Paul McCartney had his guitar with him was because he knew he was going to meet John Lennon and he wanted to show off his skills. He played 20 Flight Rock, Eddie Cochran, and apparently that massively impressed John Lennon. It's been well documented by people that were there on the day that this is the spot that they met, and this is where the meeting happened. The meeting of those 2 human beings on that day, on this spot, literally changed the world. John saw Paul play the guitar right here. A few hours earlier, Paul had seen John sing and play the guitar with the Quarrymen over the road. At this meeting, they already knew what each other were capable of. They both knew what the other one could do. They were both aware of each other's capabilities, and they were off. Off they went to produce work of such quality and volume that they would later be compared to the likes of Mozart and Beethoven in terms of quality and output. Without the event that happened on this very spot where I'm talking to you now, there would have been no Beatles. And without the Beatles, you wouldn't be listening to the music that you're listening to today. What if there'd been no Fate that day? What if there had have been a Fate, but the Quarrymen hadn't played? We know that the Quarrymen only played because the church asked them to, because they were trying to attract the youth to the Fate in the local area. And the church committee had heard that the Quarrymen played locally. That's the only reason they were here. What if their friend, Ivan Vaughan, hadn't thought to introduce them? What would the world look like and sound like today if Paul McCartney and John Lennon had not met on this spot on the 6th of July 1957? One thing that Paul McCartney said is when he watched John Lennon play over the road, he was making up some of the words, he didn't know all the lyrics. When John watched Paul play 20 Flight Rock on this very spot, he was impressed partly because Paul knew all the words. The stage that the Quarrymen played on started here. You can see this line here denotes where the battens attach the stage to the wall. That's quite a deep stage. That's quite a deep stage. I'm stood, okay, the stage is not here, but I'm stood in the spot where the lead singer would have stood on the stage, in the centre, or maybe a little bit towards the front. And that lead singer was John Lennon, prior to the Beatles, in the Quarrymen. When he was playing here, he'd already met Paul McCartney down there. Paul McCartney noticed that John Lennon had been drinking beer, and he was a little bit snooty about it. Paul McCartney did say afterwards that he thought the smell of the beery breath did put him off a little bit, but he later said that he grew to love that beery breath. Stage is here. It's just about here where Lennon met McCartney. The most incredible musical partnership of the modern era. From the hallowed spot where Lennon met McCartney, I want to ask you to like this video, that way more people will see it. I can feel that this is a place that history was made. The Beatles didn't start with Beatlemania. The Beatles started here. Every band that you currently know and love wouldn't exist without the event that happened here in 1957. 65 years ago, the meeting of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The meeting that led to the Beatles and the meeting that changed the world.